All right, so let's begin. So welcome to another practical lecture. So what we're going to cover in this practical lecture is first an update on our batch files. That's going to be a little bit complex at first glance, but we need to do this in order to understand what is going on inside the batch file. And this batch file is a batch file which you will reuse for the rest of the semester. Some of you might even use this batch file again next semester, and there's some people who still use the same batch file in their third year because it's supposed to be very versatile. It's supposed to be only thing that needs to be inside of the default package is your main, and everything else operates via main importing the correct things to compile everything else. So we talked about this briefly in the tutorials, but now we're going to look at it in more detail. And obviously, we've worked with our own batch files. We created them from scratch. We talked about all the different concepts. So we're going to do the same thing. Most of what you've seen so far is in this more up-to-date batch file. It's just got some other extra things which I could teach you, but it's going to take a long time, and therefore we're not going to do that because it's not really part of computer science per se, but it's a good thing to know, a good tool in your toolbox as a programmer to understand what is going on in here. There are a lot of comments, and you will be getting this batch file after the practical session. I'll put it on Eve itself so you can get it from there. And this is what you're going to be using to compile and run your programs from now on. There are some new things in here. We'll talk about those new things, especially this thing about JavaFX. And there's some extra variables to set. There's some if statements here for doing certain things. There's some labels here to go to different sections. And this just makes it easier or more clear what is the batch file actually doing. So that's one of the things we're going to look at. The other thing we're going to look at is working with jar files. Jar files are your equivalent of DLLs in C++. So in C++, you could write a DLL, and the DLL would allow another programmer to use your code without having to compile or do anything with your source code. You give them the DLL, at least on Windows. Otherwise, it's a shared object on Unix platforms. You basically give that to them. You give them the header files to just describe certain things there, and then they can use your code in that way. So there is a similar concept in Java, and that is called jar files. Jar files are just a fancy thing that basically stores compiled class files. So it stores Java bytecode. There is some extra things you can put inside of it, but for our purposes, it's just going to store Java bytecode. So if you remember back to practical documentation, so looking at your practical reminder page, remember the reminder page tells you exactly how to name things and where things go. You will remember there's two optional folders. Now, in this week's practical, depending on whether or not you do the bonus, you will use both. Otherwise, you might just be using data as an extra folder that you might need. So bin, we know what happens with bin. That's where our class files go. Our compiled code goes into bin. Docs, usually that's the place for our batch file. Any UML diagrams, UML class diagrams, UML other diagrams, whatever they are, and those have to be in PDF format. And then Java doc gets generated and put into this folder, but is not included in your submission. The batch file generates it, so I don't need you to provide it in that submission to Eve. Source, that contains your source files, and remember, it must be in the correct folders if you're using sub-packages. And then we have data and lib. So data is where we're going to store data files, either files we're going to read, or if we're going to save a file, that's the folder where that gets used. Now, data files is a topic we're going to be discussing in the next lecture. So we're still halfway through lecture 4, and due to some turn of events, Mr. Situnga will be giving you the other half of lecture 4 and the tutorial that goes with it tomorrow, and then I will be back on Thursday giving you the lecture 5, where we talk about exception handling and file handling. So when you learn about file handling, we'll talk about how we're actually going to use this data folder and get access to the files inside of there. The other folder that's going to be important is your lib folder. The lib folder is where we're going to put external libraries. External in the sense that you did not write that source code. So it might be provided to you by us as the lecturers of Computer Science 2A. It could be a library that is available online. So for example, something that does 3D rendering, or something that will be able to work with a Wi-Fi network differently than a wired network, something along those lines. So it's someone else wrote the code, you need to use that in some way. We put that jar files into the lib folder. And because it's in the lib folder, we need to add a few things to our batch file to take into account this lib folder. The data folder, it's only important to running source code, so you don't have to modify our batch file for that. But all the other folders already get taken care of in our batch file. So that's the second thing we're going to look at. We're going to look at how do we get jar files to actually work. So I want to show you how to get it working with the batch file. That's the one that's most important, because that's the way your assistants will test your code. And then the second way, as I mentioned already with IDEs, I will show you Eclipse, and there's something similar in the other IDEs. Unfortunately, I can only show you one, therefore I am showing you Eclipse. Okay, so let's go have a look first at our old batch file. So if you look at our old batch file, what was the process we usually followed? So at the top, you could do this clear screen if you wanted to. It's not mandatory. Even this echo off, it was just to make the output a bit cleaner when we actually run the batch file. Most important thing is we need to set the JDK path. So we set Java home, and in our path we set the /bin. We run Java C-version just to test that everything is correct. We can see that we're running the correct version of the Java compiler. Then what we want to do is set up our path variables, make sure we're in the correct directory, we're in the project directory. So if we are, for example, in the docs folder when we run, we go back to the project directory and we run from here. And then we go on to compile our code, compile our jar doc, and then run our code. After we finished everything, we go back to the docs directory, because that's the place where we started, and we finish off our program. So that's the flow of our batch file. Create the paths correctly, set the variables in our batch file, compile Java doc, run. So things are going to be more or less the same here, except there'll be a few extra steps. One of it we already spoke about, the issue, and I said I'll cover it in the future. Well, now is the future for back then. And some other things inside of this batch file is just good coding practice for batch files. Just like you have good coding practice for C++, just like you have good coding practice for Java, there is good coding practice as well for batch files. So you can always go read up about how to do some of these things or what these things mean. Again, I can't explain all this to you. It's not so important that you know exactly what this thing does, but you should know that when we talk about it now, that this is the reason why it's in the batch file. This is one of the good coding practices that makes batch files work correctly as to how you think it should run. Okay, so at the top, some comments just to indicate author as usual. Anything that you write, you should put your details at the top to indicate that you've written that specific piece of code. If there's multiple authors, we provide code to you and you modify it, then obviously you can add on to that saying that you modified that piece of code. So the first thing here is we're turning echo off because we don't want the commands to be echoed onto the command prompt as we run through the batch file. So that's why that's there. And then after that, clear the screen. So this just helps with only showing what this batch file actually did. If you run the batch file a few times, there might be old errors. If you scroll back through the command prompt, there might be old errors and you might get confused. Didn't I fix this already? Or this error was here a while ago, why is it still here? So this just gets rid of the problem if you're running the batch file over and over in the command prompt. So it clears off the screen so that you can have an empty screen to work with as you run through the batch file. This enables delayed local expansion, and you see it's called set local instead of set. That is for when you have these variables, it delays the expansion of those variables until the batch file is completely at the point where it needs to use them. Not so important as to why we need to do that right now. It's just good coding practice. So don't worry too much about that. It's just got to do with your variables and when does it actually convert this from Java home to the actual value it was set afterwards. More important for us is the next section here. So here you should see this as something familiar. You need to set Java home. Java home is the directory where the JDK is, not the bin directory. The bin directory we can take care of when we set the actual path down here. Then there's a section here talking about Java FX. So if you look through the schedule of Computer Science 2A, you would have seen that there is a section on graphical user interfaces. Those of you who did informatics, you have done graphical user interfaces. In Visual Basic, you wrote GUI applications. The user had to click on buttons, you had text fields, all of those nice things, and you had a lovely interface where you could drag and drop buttons and do those things. Since this is computer science, we're not going to take the easy road to do all of that. We're going to write our graphical user interfaces in code. So there's no interface that says, oh, drag or drop, I want the button here in the top corner. You have to write code to put the button in the top corner. And the graphical user interface we're going to be using is called Java FX. So at this point in time, you will see there is a Java FX home being set here. Right now on the machines, I cannot remember, I don't think it should be there, but it might or might not. But you can see the first variable that's set here is set to false, because at this point in time, we are not using Java FX. As soon as you are, you change this to true, and then all the things that need Java FX will work correctly. So when we get to there, that's when you turn it on and off. So if you don't need it, leave it as false. As soon as you do, change it to true. So this will set up Java FX home, Java FX modules. We'll talk about that when we get to Java FX. I just want to turn on wrapping so it doesn't go across the end of the screen. I can just wrap so you can see the line 18 is now there, and then 19 continues down at the bottom. So these are different modules available in Java FX that we need. Then we need to set the path. So you'll see there's Java home / bin and the path. So that's setting our path. So that's fine. And then down here is the Java FX argument. So only if you need Java FX does this actually matter. So again, don't worry too much about this Java FX arguments. We don't need to worry about it right now. When we get to Java FX, we'll discuss what that actually means. Now we go back to what we know from doing the batch file previously. We need to start running the project as we saw before. So again, before, what did we do is the first thing after we set our paths for our JDK, we go to the root directory of our project. So that's the directory that contains all the folders. So we're going to do exactly that. And then we start setting some variables. So one of the variables here is called error message, and this is just for the batch file to display an error message, no other reason. You see at the moment it's set to empty or blank, so there is no error message. Then we know about bin, we know about docs. Here is a new one called JDoc that just indicates the folder where the Java docs gets generated, just to keep things consistent when we need to call the command line arguments a bit later. Then we also have the lib folder, and you'll notice here there's an asterisk at the end here. It's, if you look back at the lecture, practical lecture 0, the asterisk or star is a wildcard. It matches anything. So that's something that you will need to match anything in the lib folder, specifically any jar files in there that will get matched with this as well. Then you have the source folder, and that's all the folders that we need. Again, we don't need the data folder necessarily in our batch file because our program will take care of the data folder. Now we have another thing here indicating a label. So this is similar to labels which we discussed in lecture 1, where we had a look at declaring a label there for breaking out of a for loop. So this is labels are not a thing specific to a language. There's many languages that have them. You have them in batch files as well. So this is just a nice way to indicate what the next section of code actually does. So this section of code will clean your project. So what does it mean to clean? It gets rid of any old class files. We saw this was a problem in one of the previous tutorials where we ran some code and it had a compilation error, but it still ran the previous compile code. So this will get rid of any previous compile code. You won't be able to run any old code at all because we get rid of it. Then we also remove the prac JDoc folder, and this is the Java docs folder because we want to create the updated version of the Java docs, so we get rid of all the things inside of there. So this is removing the directory. This is a flag that indicates don't ask the user for yes and no, just delete that specific directory. And /s means any subdirectories as well. So if you are watching the stream, make sure that I can't hear the sound as well. It's a bit weird to hear myself talking as I'm talking. All right, so carrying on, you can see there is some things here turning echo on and off. This is just to show you the output of this, because sometimes that's very important to see what is actually getting removed. Then lines 43 to 45, that's an if statement inside of batch files. And what is it doing is it's just checking is there any errors when I ran the previous command. If there's no errors, it continues. Otherwise, if there's an error, then it will say that there's an error cleaning the project. This will be more important as you see in the next sections. So here we got to a section where we're checking the version. So this will output the Java-C version and Java version. So we can check that we are running the correct compiler and the correct JRE. And again, if there's any error running the previous command, then what it will do is it will set the error message to whatever is wrong, and then it will go to error. So go to error means go to the label error. And you can see error is not anywhere here. There's compile, there's javadoc, there's run. Right to the bottom, there's error. So it skips over. If Java-C has a problem, it's not going to try and compile your code. It's not going to try and run javadoc. It's not going to try and run your code. It's just going to go to the error and exit the program. So this will skip over anything that can't run because there was an earlier issue. How does it know whether this thing runs correctly? If you remember back to the main method, and the main method in C++ as well, more important in C++ because it's more visible there. The return type of main, what is it? Inside C++, what is the return type? Int, an integer. What is that integer? So that integer that gets returned is a code, an error code. If it's 0, no error. If it's not 0, it means something went wrong. And that's exactly what this if statement checks. If the error level when running the previous command is not equal to 0, something went wrong. And you'll see this in all the if statements. That's what it's checking. Did the previous command run correctly? If it compiles your code correctly or it shows the version number correctly, then it returns 0. Batch file says, okay, everything ran fine, continues. If it didn't, it can't find Java-C. You get that message that says Java-C is not found, then it will say error level is not 0, it's some other number, and it will go to the error section. You'll see that same if statement every time after the end of a specific section. So if Java C is found and Java is found, technically there should be one for JavaDoc as well, but that should be fine. If you got Java and Java C, that should be enough. If everything is running correctly with your compiler, then you can try and compile. So we run Java C with extra things for JavaFX. Since we don't have JavaFX at the moment, it's going to put a blank here, but then we still have the same thing we had before: your source path, your class path, your output folder, and then what you want to compile. This line will never change because we're always going to have main as the entry point into our application. You'll notice here for class path, we're specifying the bin folder as well as the lib folder. This will tell the compiler, here is the library files, the jar files, which I can use as well. Then for JavaDoc, very similar again. JavaDoc, again, JavaFX if we need it. Then the source path, the class path again, and again, there's the lib folder if we need to. And in this case here, we're just going to do sub packages for CSC02A. And then the run, again, Java, class path, again, looking at the lib folder and calling main. Main will always be the class of the entry point of the application that will have the main method. Therefore, we leave it as main. If all of these things run correctly, we'll go to the last thing here called end, and that will just print out end. If something went wrong along the way, then it will tell you what the error is, print out that message, and then end. Okay, so it's still the same batch file you know and love, just with a little bit extra, just to make things run a little bit smoother. So if you have, for example, a situation where your code doesn't compile, it's not going to try and run JavaDoc because JavaDoc won't work. It will not try and run your code because your code didn't compile. Obviously, it's not going to run. So this batch file just makes it quicker to go through the steps of avoiding things that it shouldn't do. So that's the first batch file. There is another batch file called clean, and this is the batch file you run before you want to submit. And all it does is it cleans the project. So it'll get rid of the class files, it'll get rid of the JavaDoc folder, so that your bin folder is empty and you don't have generated JavaDoc. At that point in time, after you run this, you can then zip up your submission and submit that onto Eve. Okay, so let's see if this actually works correctly. So I'm going to open up my command prompt. Wrong key. So I'm going to run build. And if you look at the output here, you can see it has some messages. There you can see the comment for cleaning the project. You can see the old class files getting deleted. Then you can see it's checking the version. There you can see Java C version is being displayed. There's a runtime environment also displaying its version information. Compiling the project, no errors, because now the next message is generating the JavaDoc. JavaDoc has some things that it's going to output, specifically the issues where we forgot to fix up the completed JavaDoc documentation for our parameters. There's a class also, we forgot to put a JavaDoc comment for our class. And then right at the end here, you can see there it's going to run. And after it runs, that's going to be the output of the actual project, and then end. So that's if everything is working correctly. If something goes wrong, I purposely put a syntax error into the code. So it got rid of my old class files. It checked the version again, making sure everything is working there. It sees there's a compilation error, and then exits the batch file. Doesn't try and run your code, doesn't try and do JavaDoc, because it's not going to work. So as soon as it has an error, you can just see that. And I don't have to scroll through a lot of things. I can just see, okay, there's the error there. I know what to do now. Go and fix that problem on line 9. So you fix the problem. So sometimes you might see if you run the batch file, Eclipse will complain that it can't find certain things. Don't worry about that. We'll fix that in a moment. So there's all the things fixed and everything works as normal. Okay, and what should happen, so if you just save the file again, then that error message will go away. Okay, so that was the first part we need to discuss, the updated batch file. Now we're going on to the more important thing, using a jar file. So at the moment, inside my lib folder, I have a jar file. So this jar file is not the same jar file you get as a bonus in the practical. This is just a random jar file that I have, and it has some class inside of it, and that class exposes some methods of it that's available. So I want to use this now in my code. So if I look at the actual jar file, so I'm going to open it up with a program that can open up zip files, because the jar file is just a zip file. There is this manifest file. You don't worry too much about what that is, but you'll see there is my folders for my packages, and there is the compiled class file. So I want to make this available to first my program using the batch file, which it already is, because I've already included the lib folder and anything inside the lib folder for my file. I just need to put the code now for that. The thing that doesn't know anything about it is my IDE. So if I try and use anything in that class, it's not going to work. So I think the import was something along the lines of something along those lines. Now, because your IDE does not know about the jar file, it's going to complain. I don't know where this package is. I don't know what it is that you're looking for. So you need to tell the IDE, where is this thing? Where can I find this actual class files? So what we need to tell is, specifically for Eclipse, again, there is equivalent things in other programming, in other IDEs. You need to add the jar to the path that the IDE uses. We did it for ourselves in our batch file, but the IDE has its own path that it can use. In Eclipse, it's very easy. Right click on my jar file, build path, add to build path. Done. You can do it manually, but that's the easiest way to do it. If something goes wrong, then just remove it and re-add it. So now what you'll see is under referenced libraries. It's something that I can use. And what you'll see now is, instead of this being an error, it now works fine. It tells me it's not being used. I never created an instance of the class yet, but it now recognizes that package. It now recognizes the packages available, and it also knows about the class that's available. And there I can see the actual class. Now, if I double click on this class, you won't be able to see the source code because this is just a class file, but what you can see is what are the things inside of it. Okay, you can see there's some private things. Obviously, I won't be able to access those private things. There is some bytecode here. So if you look back at Practical 0 and you look at the bytecode.txt, some of this might look familiar. So like looking at it like this, it doesn't make much sense. I don't know what's going on. So let's try a different approach. So here in my main, let's just make this bigger. So here in my main, Okay, so I think this is actually a static class. So, yep. So there you can see there is some static methods available. And well, I think I forgot to put JavaDoc for this, but it would show you the JavaDoc for each of those different things. So you can get some information out of whatever's in the actual jar file for then you to use in the future. So the reason why we use jar files is that we can expose our compiled code to another user, another programmer, and any changes that we make, we just update the jar file, and then the other programmer can get those updated changes. How is this going to affect your life in the future? So today, practical 2, you will see that the bonus is using a jar file. From practical 3 onwards, we will have to use a jar file for any code that we provide to you. So you will see that you only need to code certain classes. All the classes that you don't need to code, that will be inside a jar file. When you do your practical semester test, also it will be provided code in a jar file. So it's very important that you know how to use this. So that's why this week it's a bonus, and then the next practical that you get, that will be part of the practical. You have to be able to do that. Okay, so that's the two topics which we needed to discuss today, the updated batch file and the jar files. So if you have any questions and you are in the venue, you can come and ask me now. I'll be here until the end of the session. Otherwise, I'm going to end the lecture now. Thank you. So just before you run away, I still need to take attendance, so let's do that.